Violence is never the beginning of the story. It is what happens when a human being realizes they have been invisible for far too long, when every attempt to be seen dissolves into silence, when every word spoken feels like it falls into a void that never answers back. Arthur Fleck lives inside that silence, not for a moment, not for a season, but for an entire lifetime. It slowly teaches him a quiet and devastating truth, that existing is not the same as being acknowledged, that breathing does not guarantee belonging, and that a person can stand in the middle of a crowded city and still feel like a ghost no one remembers creating. What Arthur is starving for is not attention in the superficial sense, but recognition at a deeply human level, the kind that says, I see you, you matter, you are real. Without it, something begins to fracture beneath the surface, something subtle at first, like a hairline crack in glass, almost invisible, almost ignorable, until pressure builds and that crack spreads into something irreversible. The need to be seen is not a luxury, it is as essential as oxygen in the architecture of the human psyche. When that need is denied over and over again, it does not simply disappear, it transforms. It mutates into something heavier, something darker, something that begins to ask a dangerous question: if no one will see me when I am quiet, then what will it take for them to notice me at all? This is where Arthur's internal world begins to shift, not in a sudden explosion, but in a slow, suffocating erosion of hope, where every failed interaction, every overlooked moment, every dismissive glance becomes another piece of evidence reinforcing the belief that he is fundamentally unworthy of being acknowledged. That belief starts to reshape his identity, because when a person cannot find validation externally, they begin to construct a version of themselves that might force the world to respond, a version that is louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. Not because they want to harm, but because they want to exist in a way that cannot be denied. In that transformation, the line between expression and distortion begins to blur, because what we are witnessing is not the birth of something new, but the consequence of something long neglected, a wound that never had a witness, a voice that echoed but was never answered. The most unsettling part of Arthur's story is not what he eventually becomes, but how understandable the beginning feels. If you have ever spoken and felt unheard, if you have ever stood in a room and felt invisible, if you have ever questioned whether your presence made any difference at all, then somewhere, in a quiet and uncomfortable way, you already understand the first step of his descent. What makes Arthur even more fragile is not only that he is unseen, but that he has spent his entire life learning to perform a version of himself that he hopes the world will accept. A quiet and exhausting act of emotional survival, where authenticity feels dangerous and rejection feels inevitable. Deep down, Arthur does not believe that who he truly is would ever be enough, so he constructs a mask, not out of deception, but out of desperation. A version of himself that smiles when he feels empty, that tries to entertain when he feels broken, that reaches out even when every part of him expects to be pushed away. This is where his psychological defense begins to take shape, not as something dramatic, but as something painfully subtle. Humor becomes his shield, not the kind that brings joy, but the kind that hides pain, a form of sublimation where suffering is translated into something socially acceptable, something that allows him to exist in spaces that would otherwise reject him completely. Yet this defense carries a hidden cost, because every time he performs, he moves one step further away from his true self. Over time, that distance becomes unbearable. He no longer knows where the mask ends and where he begins. This creates an internal conflict that quietly consumes him, the tension between the person he is and the person he feels forced to be, where one side is aching to be understood and the other side is convinced that understanding will never come. This contradiction traps him in a loop, where he keeps trying, keeps reaching, keeps hoping, even when every experience reinforces the same painful outcome. What makes this cycle so dangerous is not the rejection itself, but the meaning he assigns to it. Each moment of dismissal does not feel random, it feels personal. It feels like confirmation that something is fundamentally wrong within him. Instead of questioning the world, he begins to question his own worth, slowly. Internalizing the belief that he is invisible not because others fail to see, but because he is not worth seeing. That belief reshapes his emotional reality, turning ordinary interactions into sources of anxiety, turning small moments into overwhelming evidence of failure. As this pressure builds, the mask he has been wearing starts to crack, not because he chooses to remove it, but because he no longer has the strength to hold it together. In that fragile space, where the performance collapses and the real self is exposed, there is nothing left to protect him from the weight of his own thoughts. This is the moment where vulnerability transforms into something else entirely. When a person feels their true self has been rejected again and again, they stop trying to be accepted. Instead, they begin searching for another way to be acknowledged, not through connection, but through impact, not through understanding, but through presence that cannot be ignored. What we are witnessing here is not a sudden change, but the slow unraveling of a psyche that has spent too long pretending, too long hoping, and too long waiting for a kind of recognition that never came. Inside Arthur, there is a quiet war that never stops, a conflict that does not announce itself with noise but reveals itself through hesitation, through longing, through the constant question of whether he should reach out or retreat. At the core of his psychology lies a contradiction he cannot resolve. He deeply needs connection, yet he is convinced that connection will only lead to rejection. This creates a painful loop where every desire to be close to others is immediately followed by the fear of being exposed, misunderstood, or dismissed. He exists in a state of emotional paralysis, wanting to be seen but terrified of what will happen if he truly is. To be seen means to be judged, and for someone who already believes he is fundamentally flawed, judgment feels inevitable. This is where his unmet needs begin to shape his inner world, because what Arthur is lacking is not simply companionship, but a sense of safe recognition, a space where he can exist without performing, without proving, without apologizing for who he is. Without that, his identity becomes unstable, constantly shifting based on how others respond to him. He has no internal anchor, no solid sense of self that exists independently from the outside world. Every interaction becomes emotionally charged. It is never just a conversation, it is a test of worth, a moment where his entire sense of identity is placed at risk. When those moments repeatedly end in disappointment, the conflict inside him intensifies. One part of him still hopes, still reaches, still believes that maybe this time will be different, while another part grows more cynical, more withdrawn, more certain that the outcome will always be the same. This internal split begins to erode his ability to trust not only others but also himself. He no longer knows which voice to believe, the one that seeks connection or the one that warns against it. As this tension builds, his emotional needs become louder, more urgent, more desperate. Unmet needs do not fade. They accumulate, pressing against the mind like a weight that becomes harder to carry with each passing day. Eventually, the need to be understood transforms into something else, not because it changes in nature, but because it has been denied for too long. When a person reaches that point, they no longer ask to be accepted. They begin to question whether acceptance was ever possible. That question is where something fragile begins to collapse. Without the belief that connection can exist, the entire foundation of hope starts to dissolve, leaving behind a space where loneliness is no longer just a feeling, but a permanent state of being. In that state, the human need for recognition does not disappear. It searches for another form, another outlet, another way to prove that existence still matters, even if it no longer looks like connection at all. The turning point in Arthur's mind does not arrive as a loud, dramatic moment, but as a quiet realization that settles in like a cold weight, the kind that does not shock you at first but slowly drains the last remaining pieces of hope. What finally breaks him is not a single event, it is the accumulation of confirmations that everything he feared about himself might actually be true, that he is not simply overlooked, but fundamentally unworthy of being acknowledged. In that moment, something shifts in the way he interprets the world. Before, there was still a fragile belief that if he tried harder, if he adjusted himself more carefully, if he performed better, then maybe someone would eventually see him. But now, that belief begins to collapse, replaced by a more dangerous conclusion that no amount of effort will ever change how invisible he feels. This realization strips away the last layer of his emotional defense because denial can only exist as long as there is hope to protect. Once hope is gone, denial has nothing left to hold on to, leaving Arthur exposed to a version of reality that feels absolute and unforgiving. In that space, he is forced to confront a painful question that he has avoided his entire life, not why people do not see him, but whether there was ever anything in him worth seeing in the first place. This question does not come with an answer, it comes with a silence that feels like confirmation. That silence becomes the trigger, not because it is loud, but because it is final. It closes the door on the possibility of change. When a person reaches that point, where they no longer believe that connection is possible, their entire psychological orientation begins to shift. If being accepted is no longer an option, then the mind starts searching for an alternative way to resolve the need for recognition. This is where Arthur's perception begins to distort, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that feels strangely logical to him. If he cannot be seen through kindness, then perhaps he can be seen through intensity. If he cannot be acknowledged through vulnerability, then perhaps he can exist through something that demands attention, something that forces the world to react. This is the moment where the meaning of being seen changes. It is no longer about being understood, it is about being undeniable. That shift marks the true beginning of his transformation. Once the goal is no longer connection but recognition at any cost, the boundaries that once held him back begin to lose their importance. What remains is a single, powerful drive to prove that he exists in a way that cannot be ignored. What makes this moment so unsettling is how quietly it happens, how there is no clear line between who he was and who he is becoming, only a gradual redefinition of what it means to matter, shaped not by hope, but by the absence of it. The collapse does not look like a fall, it feels more like a quiet surrender, the moment when Arthur stops trying to reconcile the person he wanted to be with the reality. He can no longer escape. For so long, his identity depended on a fragile hope that if he kept reaching out, kept performing, kept adjusting himself, he might eventually find a place where he belonged. But once that hope dissolves, something inside him begins to reorganize, not toward healing, but toward survival in a world he now believes will never accept him. This is where the transformation becomes visible, not as chaos, but as clarity, a cold and unsettling clarity where the rules that once governed his behavior no longer seem relevant. Those rules were built on the assumption that connection was possible. Now that assumption has been erased, leaving him in a psychological landscape where meaning must be reconstructed from scratch. In that reconstruction, Arthur no longer defines himself by how well he can fit into the world, but by how impossible it is for the world to ignore him. This shift changes everything because it removes the need for approval and replaces it with the need for impact. In that space, his emotions begin to flatten in a way that feels both relieving and deeply concerning. The constant anxiety of seeking validation is replaced by a sense of detachment, a feeling that nothing he does will restore what he has lost. Therefore, nothing needs to be restrained in the same way anymore. This detachment is not freedom. It is the absence of emotional consequence, a state where the usual boundaries that guide behavior begin to fade, not because he chooses to break them, but because they no longer hold meaning for him. What emerges from this is a new identity, one that is no longer built on being accepted, but on being undeniable. This identity carries a certain stability that his previous self never had because it does not depend on others for validation. It defines its own existence through presence alone. Yet beneath that stability lies something deeply fragile because this version of Arthur is not the resolution of his pain. It is the adaptation to it, a way of existing that protects him from further rejection by removing the need to be accepted altogether. In doing so, it also removes the possibility of genuine connection, leaving him in a state where he is finally seen, but no longer in the way he once desired. What he has become is not someone who is understood, but someone who cannot be ignored. That distinction marks the true depth of his transformation because it shows that the goal was never destruction. It was recognition. But when recognition could not be achieved through connection, it found another path. One that reshaped his entire sense of self into something that feels powerful on the surface but is built on the quiet ruins of everything he once hoped to be. What remains after the transformation is not relief, but a different kind of emptiness, one that no longer aches in the same way but settles into something colder, something more permanent. When Arthur lets go of the need to be accepted, he also lets go of the part of himself that believed in connection. That loss reshapes his emotional world in ways that are not immediately visible because on the surface, there is a sense of control, a sense that he is no longer at the mercy of other people's opinions, no longer waiting for approval that may never come. Beneath that control lies a deeper consequence, the gradual erosion of his ability to feel genuine attachment. Attachment requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is what led him to this breaking point in the first place. his mind adapts by distancing itself from anything that might recreate that pain. Over time, this distance becomes his default state, not just toward others, but toward himself, creating a version of existence where emotions are filtered, where empathy becomes selective, where the complexity of human connection is reduced to something simpler, something more manageable, but also something far less human. This is the long-term cost of unresolved psychological wounds. When a need as fundamental as being seen is repeatedly denied, the mind does not stop needing it. It learns to survive without it. That survival comes at the expense of depth, warmth, and the ability to truly relate. In that space, Arthur no longer measures his existence through connection, but through presence, through the impact he leaves behind. While that may provide a sense of stability, it also isolates him in a way that is far more absolute than anything he experienced before. Earlier, his loneliness was filled with longing, with the hope that things could be different. But now, that hope has been replaced by certainty, and certainty removes the possibility of change. It locks him into a version of himself that no longer questions whether he can be understood but no longer cares either. That indifference becomes one of the most significant psychological consequences because it signals the end of internal conflict, not because it has been resolved, but because it has been abandoned. When conflict disappears in this way, it does not bring peace. It brings stillness, a kind of emotional silence where growth becomes unlikely because growth requires friction, requires doubt, requires the willingness to confront discomfort. Without those elements, the self becomes fixed, rigid, unable to evolve beyond the identity it has constructed to survive. This is where Arthur's journey leaves its most lasting mark, not in what he does, but in what he loses, the ability to hope, the ability to reach, the ability to believe that being seen could ever feel safe. In losing those, he gains a form of certainty that protects him from further rejection but also ensures that the connection he once needed will remain permanently out of reach, turning what was once a temporary wound into a defining state of being. There is a quiet reason why Arthur's story feels uncomfortably familiar, and it is not because most people have lived his life, but because many have felt pieces of what he carries inside. That subtle and persistent sense of being overlooked, of speaking and not being heard, of existing in spaces where your presence does not seem to change anything. Maybe it does not happen in extreme ways, maybe it is something smaller, like being the one who always listens but is rarely asked how they feel, or being surrounded by people yet still carrying a loneliness that no one seems to notice. Over time, those moments begin to accumulate, forming a quiet question that lingers beneath the surface, asking whether you truly matter in the way you hope you do. That question is where the connection begins because Arthur's pain is not distant, it is an amplified version of something deeply human, the fear that you could disappear and the world would continue unchanged. For many people, that fear is something they learn to live with, to manage, to silence, but it never fully goes away. It simply waits, surfacing in moments of rejection, in moments of misunderstanding, in moments where you try to explain yourself and feel like your words are being translated into something else entirely, something that no longer represents who you are. That experience creates a quiet kind of exhaustion, because it is not just about being alone, it is about feeling unseen even when you are not. That is a different kind of loneliness, one that is harder to articulate, one that does not always have visible signs, but still shapes the way you move through the world, the way you guard your thoughts, the way you hesitate before opening up. Somewhere along the way, you learned that being fully seen comes with the risk of being fully rejected. So you begin to hold parts of yourself back, not because you want to hide, but because you are trying to protect something fragile, something that has already been hurt before. In that sense, Arthur's journey becomes less about what he becomes and more about what he represents, a reflection of what can happen when that protective instinct grows too strong, when the fear of being misunderstood turns into a certainty that understanding will never come. While most people do not follow the same path, the emotional roots remain recognizable. The need to be seen does not disappear. It adapts, it hides, it waits, and sometimes it reveals itself in ways that are easy to overlook, like the way someone laughs a little too quickly, or the way they withdraw just as a conversation begins to feel real, or the way they downplay their own feelings to avoid being dismissed. These are the quieter versions of the same struggle, the ones that do not draw attention, the ones that do not disrupt the world, but still shape a person's inner life in profound ways. When you look at Arthur through that lens, the distance between his story and your own begins to shrink. Not because you are the same, but because the need at the center of it all is something almost everyone has felt at some point, the simple, fragile desire to be seen and understood, and the quiet fear of what happens when that desire goes unanswered for too long. What Arthur is left with in the end is not chaos, but a profound and unsettling stillness, the kind of emptiness that does not scream for attention but quietly consumes everything that once gave life meaning. When the need for connection is buried deep enough, it does not simply disappear, it leaves behind a hollow space where something essential used to exist. In that space, there is no longer a struggle between hope and disappointment, no longer a tension between reaching out and pulling away. There is only a flat, unchanging silence, where emotions no longer rise and fall with the same intensity, where the world feels distant, almost unreal, as if it exists behind a layer of glass that cannot be broken. This is what makes his loneliness so different from the kind most people recognize. It is no longer filled with longing, it is no longer driven by the desire to be understood. It is a state where even the desire has faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance that connection is not something meant for him. In that acceptance, there is a strange sense of calm, but it is not peace, it is resignation. The kind that settles in when a person stops expecting anything from the world, stops asking questions, stops searching for meaning in places where they have only found absence. What remains is a version of existence that feels detached from everything, where interactions become surface level, where emotions feel muted, where even moments that should carry weight seem to pass without leaving a mark. Without the belief that anything truly matters, nothing holds the same significance it once did. This creates a psychological distance that is both protective and isolating. While it shields him from further disappointment, it also removes the possibility of genuine connection, leaving him in a space where he is present but not truly engaged, where he exists but does not feel fully alive. This is the quiet tragedy of his state. Not that he is alone, but that he no longer feels the absence of others in the same way. The part of him that once longed for connection has gone silent. In its place is a stillness that is difficult to reach, difficult to understand, and even more difficult to change. When you look at him in this state, what you see is not just isolation, but the aftermath of a long emotional journey that has led him here, a place where the world continues to move, continues to speak, continues to exist in all its complexity, while he remains on the outside of it. Not trying to get in anymore. Not expecting to be invited. Simply existing in a quiet, unbroken distance that defines his entire inner world. In the end, what lingers is not the transformation itself, but the uncomfortable realization that it did not happen overnight. It was built slowly, quietly, through moments so small they were almost invisible, the kind of moments most people forget but some people carry for years. Arthur's story is not about a single breaking point. It is about what happens when no one notices the cracks forming in the first place, when a person is left alone with their thoughts long enough that those thoughts begin to reshape reality. What makes this so difficult to confront is that nothing about his need was unreasonable. There was no grand ambition, no impossible demand, just the simple desire to be acknowledged, to feel like his existence had weight. Yet that small, human need went unanswered for so long that it changed the way he understood himself, the way he understood others, and eventually, the way he understood the world. When you follow that path all the way to where he stands now, you are left with a question that does not belong only to him, but to anyone who has ever felt unseen. The real tragedy is not that he changed, but that the change feels like a response, not an accident. A reaction to something missing rather than something inherently broken. That realization forces a deeper reflection, one that moves beyond judgment and into something more unsettling. It suggests that under the right conditions, under enough silence, under enough neglect, the line between who we are and who we could become is not as fixed as we like to believe. Maybe that is why his story stays with us, not because we agree with where he ends up, but because we recognize the beginning. We recognize the feeling of being overlooked, of being misunderstood, of wondering whether anyone would notice if we simply stopped trying. In that recognition, there is a quiet discomfort, a question that does not have an easy answer. It asks us to consider not just what happened to him, but what happens around us every day in smaller, less visible ways, in people who are still waiting to be seen, still holding on to the hope that someone will understand before that hope disappears completely. The question remains, not as a conclusion, but as something that lingers long after the story ends: how many people are still trying to be seen right now, and how different would their story become if someone truly noticed them before it was too late to reach them at all?